The Great Hall of Ashbourne Hall was not silent on Christmas Eve of 1814. It was something worse than silent. It was full of people who had stopped pretending not to notice. 32 county guests stood among the dressed branches and the lit candles, and every one of them watched the woman in the plain gray dress walk toward the door with a letter folded in her hand. She did not hurry. She did not look back. She had learned, in 6 years of service at Ashbourne Hall, that dignity was the only luggage no one could confiscate, and she carried it now through the warmth and the candlelight as if the hall belonged to her, even though she had been told, twice in this room and once on a frozen lane 3 months past, that it never had. She was 4 steps from the door when his voice came. It was not loud. It did not need to be. What happened in those next moments would be spoken of in the county for years, and always the same way. That Lord Nicholas Ashbourne, Earl of Ashbourne, crossed his own great hall and said one sentence before 32 witnesses, and that sentence made everything that had come before it legible in a new way, the way a single candle makes a room visible after a long dark. But that is the end of the story. To understand it, one must begin in October, when the leaves on the park's elms were still copper, and there was still enough warmth in the air to make a dismissal feel, for a moment, like freedom. Edwina Hartwell had served Ashbourne Hall since she was 19 years old. She had come at her mother's suggestion and her father's necessity, the Hartwell family's circumstances having contracted sharply the year the cottage's mortgage note came due, and her father's health declined with it. 6 years she had given the house. She had managed a staff of 14, maintained the household accounts to within 3 shillings of the quarterly estimates, supervised the repair of the east wing's plasterwork during the summer of 1812, and ensured that Thomas, the Earl's 8-year-old son, ate his meals on schedule even during the months his father was in London and the house ran on its own habits. She earned £12 per annum. She did not consider herself remarkable. She considered herself useful, which she had found by 30, to be the more durable quality. She had known the Dowager disliked her. That was not a surprise. Lady Dorothea Ashbourne was 70 years old, precise as a surveyor's instrument, and organized around a belief in correct order that was as genuine and as immovable as the house's stone foundations. She believed a housekeeper should be invisible and obedient, and not possess the kind of steady gray eyes that young earls occasionally looked at for slightly longer than the occasion required. Edie's eyes were, in fact, gray, and she could not do anything about them, and she had long since decided that Lady Dorothea's discomfort was Lady Dorothea's to manage. The dismissal came on a Tuesday morning in October, while Nicholas was in the North Field consulting with his steward about a drainage problem, and therefore, by the Dowager's calculation, sufficiently occupied to miss the occasion entirely. Lady Dorothea summoned Edie to the drawing-room and delivered the news in the formal language she reserved for household transactions. Miss Hartwell's services would no longer be required. A character reference would be provided, stating only that she had been employed and had not committed any visible impropriety. She would receive 1 month's wages in lieu of notice, which amounted to £1, and she would vacate the housekeeper's rooms by Thursday. Mrs. Prewitt, the senior parlour-maid, was standing in the passage outside the drawing-room door with a pressed tablecloth in her arms when Edie emerged. She had heard most of it through the paneling. Her face held the particular still quality of a woman absorbing a shock she had been afraid was coming. She had no cause, Mrs. Prewitt said, very quietly. She had rank, Edie said, which was a different thing, and in 1814, more than sufficient. She packed her trunk on Wednesday evening. Thomas found her at it and stood in the doorway of the housekeeper's room with his hands jammed into the pockets of his coat, his dark eyes moving from the trunk to her face and back again with an 8-year-old's careful assessment of disaster. "Are you going away?" he asked. She told him she was, and that it was a perfectly ordinary event, and that the house would carry on very well. He stood in the doorway for another moment, and then said in a small, flat voice, "No, it won't," and walked away before she could answer him. She discovered later that he had said the same thing to his father that evening. Nicholas had been in the library, reviewing the drainage estimates, and had not entirely registered the conversation until it was finished, which was the particular failure of the autumn of 1814 at Ashbourne Hall. A man too deep in the management of the visible estate to see what was quietly holding the invisible one together. She left on Thursday morning with her trunk in the carrier's cart and the October cold coming off the park in long gray drifts. The dowager was not present to see her go. 3 of the kitchen maids were, and Mrs. Prewitt, who pressed Edie's hand once and could not speak. The village of Ashbourne was 2 miles from the hall. The Hartwell cottage was at its eastern edge, a stone building of 4 rooms that held, along with its chill and its memory of her father, a £40 debt against the original mortgage note. £40 was 3 years and 4 months of Edie's wage at £12 per annum. She had saved £9 over 6 years, which meant the debt was, in practical terms, a wall she could not climb in any reasonable time on any wage she was likely to earn. She settled into the cottage and began inquiring about positions in the neighboring villages and tried not to think about the gray light through windows that looked east rather than south, or about Thomas's face in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. The hall fell apart by degrees, and the degrees were quickly reached. If you have found yourself wondering how a single household manager could represent the difference between order and disorder in a great house, consider that the art is not in performing the individual tasks, but in holding the system in one mind simultaneously, knowing which provisions need reordering before they are needed, which staff will fall into conflict without management, which guests' dietary requirements must be communicated to the kitchen before the dinner, not during it. Edie had held that system for 6 years. The woman Lady Dorothea appointed in her place, a Mrs. Coburn from a house near Bath, was competent in the abstract and paralyzed by the particular. She did not know that the under-butler and the second footman had a 7-year feud over a misplaced watch. She did not know that the cream sauce at Ashbourne was made differently than it was made anywhere else, and that guests expected the difference. She did not know that Thomas ate with more willingness if his meal was brought to the library, where he was reading, rather than to the dining room, where he sat alone at a table built for 10 and sometimes cried. Thomas stopped eating with any regularity by the 2nd week of November. Nicholas learned of it on a Wednesday, when his son's governess, a Miss Parton, came to his study with her hands folded and reported that the child had eaten half a bowl of porridge at breakfast and refused everything since. Nicholas went to the library. Thomas was sitting in the window seat with a book across his lap, watching the park. He turned when his father came in, and his face held that same flat, careful quality it had shown in the housekeeper's doorway in October. "I'm not hungry," Thomas said. "You must eat," Nicholas said. "Edie used to bring biscuits at 4, Thomas said. "On the blue plate, the plate with the rim." Nicholas had nothing to say to that. The specific grief of children for the particular arrangements of a lost adult is not something a father's authority can address, and he left the library having accomplished nothing except the confirmation that something he had failed to protect was costing his son more than it had cost him to lose it. By December, the household was in visible disorder. The Christmas preparations at Ashbourne Hall were an annual institution the county had relied upon for 40 years. The hall was opened for a gathering on Christmas Eve that drew 32 neighboring families and their connections, and the house was expected to be warm, bright, provisioned, and managed without visible effort. In Edie's 6 years, it had been all of those things. In Mrs. Coburn's first December, the Yew Garlands arrived 3 days late. 2 kitchen maids gave notice in the same week, and the wine cellar's winter inventory showed a deficit that no one could adequately explain. Miss Cecily Vane arrived in the second week of December with her mother, both of them installed in the guest wing at Lady Dorothea's invitation, and the invitation's purpose was clear to every member of the household staff, even if it was not formally announced. Cecily was 23 years old, well-formed, beautifully dressed, and possessed of a social competence that had been trained into her like a language she had never known herself without. She spoke to Nicholas at dinner with easy grace. She played the pianoforte with clean precision. She walked in the garden with Thomas once, correctly, and did not kneel in the frost to show him the pattern of ice on a stone, because that was not in her repertoire, and Thomas had come inside afterwards and said nothing about it. Mrs. Prewitt watched Miss Vane move through the house and kept her own counsel until the day she found Nicholas standing at the window of the ground-floor passage, looking out at the park with the specific stillness of a man who is waiting for himself to decide something. "The larder accounts are 3 weeks behind, my lord," she said. She said only that, and withdrew. Nicholas rode to the village on a gray Thursday morning, 2 weeks before Christmas, with the collar of his greatcoat turned up against a wind that carried the first real cold of winter. He found Edie at the cottage table, writing figures in a small notebook by the light of a single candle, because coal was an expense she was managing carefully. The cottage was clean and spare and cold. A cup of tea sat at her elbow that had clearly been there long enough to stop steaming. She rose when he knocked and opened the door with the particular composure of a woman who has decided in advance that she will not let any caller see her flinch. He looked at the room before he looked at her. She noticed that. The single candle, the notebook, the untouched tea, the worn mat at the hearth, where a better fire should have been burning. Something moved in his jaw, a small tightening, and was immediately controlled. "I wish to discuss a formal arrangement," he said. She said she was listening. He told her the terms clearly, because he was a man who did not obscure the practical in order to manage an emotional reaction. He needed her to return to Ashbourne Hall in the capacity of senior household manager with a revised wage of £15 per annum. The cottage debt, £40 against the Hartwell family mortgage, would be discharged immediately from the estate accounts, which would remove the immediate material pressure on her circumstances. She would have full authority over the household staff, including the freedom to release Mrs. Coburn with 1 month's notice if she found the arrangement unworkable. She would not be answerable to Lady Dorothea in matters of household management. Those were the terms. Edie stood by the cottage door and looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved the bare branch of the pear tree against the window glass. She was aware, in the way that her body registered things her mind was still sorting, that he had ridden 2 miles in December cold, and that his offer was more than the situation strictly required. The debt discharge was not necessary to secure her return. It was an act of a different order, and she filed it carefully in the part of herself that noticed things she did not permit herself to act upon. She said yes. She did not say it because the debt was gone or because the wage was improved, though both mattered considerably. She said yes because Thomas had stopped eating, and because the house she had spent 6 years learning was running without its own knowledge of itself, and because she was, at her core, a person who could not stand at a distance from a thing that was failing when she knew how to help it hold. She returned on a Saturday. Mrs. Prewitt met her at the kitchen door with the expression of a person reprieved from a sentence they had not quite admitted they were serving. "The larder accounts," Edie said. 3 weeks behind and 1 side of mutton short, Mrs. Prewitt said. "Start with the accounts," Edie said, and went inside. By the 3rd day, Thomas was eating again. She had not done anything specific or ceremonial. She had knocked on the library door at 4 o'clock, brought the blue-rimmed plate with oat biscuits, and sat in the chair across from his window seat and read her own book in companionable silence, while he ate 3 biscuits, and then a 4th, without appearing to notice he was doing it. He did not mention that she had been away. She did not mention it either. Some conversations between adults and children take place entirely in the repair of small habits, and both of them understood that without needing to name it. Nicholas passed the library doorway on his way to the stairs that evening and stopped. He stood in the corridor for a moment, looking through the gap in the door at his son in the window seat and Edie in the chair across from him, the two of them reading in the firelight with the particular peacefulness of people who trusted each other without negotiation. Something in his expression changed. It was not a large change, and it was gone before it could be clearly read. But it was the kind of change that rewrites the whole of a face from the inside. He had not been present for his wife's last illness. He had been in London, attending to estate matters that had seemed, at the time, genuinely urgent. And Margaret had died in the early hours of a February morning in 1812, with only her maid and Miss Parton in the room. He had arrived at Ashbourne 2 days later, and found Thomas sitting on the bottom stair with his arms around his own knees, and the boy had looked up at his father with a question in his face that Nicholas had never been able to answer to his own satisfaction. He had not known how to reach his son across the distance that question created, and 2 years of conscientious fathering had not entirely closed it. He had been trying, in the way of a man who is not naturally fluent in the language of small children, and not quite succeeding. He watched Edie and Thomas in the firelight for a moment longer than he should have, and then went upstairs. The days before Christmas moved with the accumulating weight of preparations. Edie restored the household accounts to order, dismissed Mrs. Coburn with a full month's wages and a genuine reference, and redistributed the staff's responsibilities with the efficiency of someone returning to a familiar instrument after a season away. The garlands went up on the 20th. The wine cellar deficit was traced to a provisioning error in October and corrected. The kitchen ran warm and purposeful again. Lady Dorothea watched all of this from her accustomed chair in the drawing-room, with the expression of a woman who has bet on a particular outcome and is calculating how close it still might come. She had not acknowledged Edie's return directly. She had instead increased her visible attentions to Cecily, positioning the younger woman beside Nicholas at every opportunity, which Nicholas accepted with a courtesy that offered nothing and refused nothing. The particular diplomatic posture of a man who had not yet decided something he was aware he needed to decide. It was Cecily herself who voiced the dismissive label the second time, though she might not have recognized it as cruelty. She said it in the drawing-room one evening, in the hearing of her mother and Lady Dorothea, while Edie was visible at the far end of the corridor, arranging the final branch of yew above the hall door. She said it lightly, with the casual authority of a woman whose position in the house had been presented to her as settled. Oh, the housekeeper. She manages everything very neatly. One would never know she was there. Mrs. Prewitt, who had been passing with a tray, heard it. She reported it to Edie afterwards, not to wound her, but because Mrs. Prewitt had long since decided that Edie deserved to know the weather of the house she was inhabiting. Edie set the last branch of yew into its bracket and looked at it for a moment to see that it was level, and then said, mildly, that being unobtrusive was in fact the technical definition of doing the job well, which was both true and the only armor she had available. Thomas developed a fever on the 22nd of December. It was not dangerous, Miss Parton said, assessing the child with practiced hands. Children of his age ran these fevers in winter. He needed rest, warmth, fluids, and careful watching through the night. She herself had a household obligation in the village she had been anticipating for 3 weeks. and she looked at Edie with the particular hope of a woman who has found the right person for a difficulty she cannot manage herself. Edie told her to go. She sat with Thomas from 9 o'clock that evening, with a candle on the table beside his bed, and a cup of cooled broth that she persuaded him to take in small sips every half hour. He was hot and restless and occasionally frightened in the way of children who are sick at night and discover that the world is larger and less controllable than it seems in daylight. She read to him from a book he liked about a young sailor's voyages, and when he was too hot to listen, she dampened a cloth and folded it over his forehead. And when he was cold, she tucked his blankets more firmly and held his hand until his breathing steadied. Lady Dorothea appeared at the door of the sick room at 10:30. She was dressed for bed, her gray hair in its night plait, her expression carrying the weight of a woman who had made a decision and intended to enforce it. "This is not your function," she said. "Ring for the night nurse." "There is no night nurse engaged," Edie said, without raising her voice or turning fully from Thomas. "I sent for Dr. Marsh this afternoon. He advised continuous attendance through the night. I am attending." "You are a housekeeper," Lady Dorothea said. "Not a nursemaid." "Tonight I am both," Edie said. "If his fever rises above what I have seen, I will send for you immediately. He is sleeping now. I would ask that we do not disturb him." Lady Dorothea stood in the doorway for a long, cold moment. She was not, at her core, a woman without love for her grandchild. She was a woman whose categories for expressing it had never included sitting in a chair at midnight with a damp cloth. She looked at Thomas's sleeping face, and at Edie's steady hands, and at the candle burning on the table. And she left. She did not come back that night. Nicholas came at 2 o'clock in the morning. Edie did not hear him in the corridor. She heard the door and turned, and found him standing in it, with his coat half buttoned as if he had dressed quickly, his face holding an expression she had not seen on it before. He looked at Thomas first, checking the child's breathing with a father's specific anxiety. And then he looked at Edie. She said quietly that the fever had broken an hour ago. Thomas was resting comfortably. She expected he would be well enough for a soft breakfast by morning. Nicholas stood in the doorway and did not move for a moment. He had been standing there, she understood, for longer than she knew. The candle had been burning for some time when she last checked it, and there was a quality of held stillness about him that was not the stillness of a man who had just arrived. He said, very low, "You did not leave." She said she had had no reason to. He looked at his son's face in the candlelight, and something in his expression was open in a way it rarely was. The discipline that organized his features at rest for a moment, so that the thing underneath it was briefly visible. The grief of a man who had not been present when he should have been, and who did not know how to forgive himself for the distance it had put between him and his child, and who was looking at a woman who had stayed in the room where he had not, 2 years ago, been present to stay. He did not say any of that. He was not a man who spoke his interior at 2 o'clock in a sick room. He stayed for another quarter hour, sitting in the chair on the opposite side of Thomas's bed, and then he said good night and withdrew, and Edie sat in the candle's warmth with Thomas's steady breathing and the particular knowledge, settled and careful in her chest, that something had shifted in the house's weather without a single word being said about it. The Christmas Eve gathering arrived on a wave of cold air and carriage wheels on the frost-hardened drive. 32 guests filled the great hall and the drawing room and spilled into the passage, their voices rising with the warmth of good fires and better wine, their coats taken by the footman Edie had positioned and briefed with the precision of a military arrangement. The hall was beautiful. She had made it beautiful. The garlands were dark and fragrant. The candles were lit at every level. The food emerging from the kitchen was correct and plentiful and timed to the hour. She stood at the edge of it, and felt, in a way she rarely permitted herself, that the house was exactly what it should be. Lady Dorothea chose that hour. She moved through the assembled guests with the authority of a woman in her own domain, and found the moment when the room's attention was diffused enough that a targeted cruelty could be delivered with maximum impact and minimum apparent malice. She approached the small group near the fire where Nicholas was standing with Cecily and two of the neighboring landowners, and she said, in a carrying voice calibrated to be heard by the people nearest the door, "Miss Hartwell, the kitchen requires guidance on the serving order. You will find it more appropriate to remain with the staff this evening. These are guests, not your concern." The room did not fall silent. It shifted. The particular quality of a crowded space when everyone has registered something without looking at it. Edie stood very still. She was near the hall table, setting a final spray of holly into the arrangement she had been tending, and she was aware, with precise, unhappy clarity, of the faces nearest her. Mrs. Prewitt at the passage door, her expression tight with anger she was not permitted to express. Cecily near the fire, a small satisfied settling in her posture, the two landowners looking at their wine. Nicholas, at the far end of the group, had gone still in the way of a man who is controlling his first response. She had been dismissed from this room once before, in a different way, on a different Tuesday. She knew the shape of it. She set the sprig of holly straight, picked up the small card of the evening's arrangement she had been carrying, and walked toward the passage door without hurrying. She went to the housekeeper's room and took out a sheet of paper and a pen, and she wrote a letter to Thomas. It was not a long letter. She told him that she was glad the fever had broken, and that the blue-rimmed plate would remain in the kitchen, and that the sailor in his book reached his destination in the 7th chapter, if he had not already found it. She told him that he was a good reader and a sensible person, and that she expected him to be both of those things for many years. She folded the letter and wrote his name on the outside, and she stood at the housekeeper's table in the warm, small room that had been hers for 6 years, and was, she understood now, preparing to no longer be hers. And she thought that she had done what she had come back to do, and that it was, in its way, enough. She put on her winter cloak, because the night was cold. She lifted her portmanteau, which she had not fully unpacked, because some part of her had known this was possible, and she carried it down the back corridor toward the side passage that led to the entrance hall, which was the nearest way to the door. She was 4 steps from the door when his voice came. "Miss Hartwell." He had crossed the hall from the drawing-room entrance. She could hear the shift in the room's noise behind him, the conversations dimming as 32 guests registered what was happening. He was not hurrying. He was walking at the pace of a man who has decided and is taking the decision to its conclusion. She stopped. She turned. Nicholas Ashbourne crossed the last 10 feet of his great hall and stopped in front of her. He looked at the portmanteau in her hand, and at the letter she still held in the other. And then he looked at her face, with the direct, focused attention he gave to things that mattered to him, which was not many things, but which was absolute when it was present. He reached out and took the portmanteau from her hand. He held it at his side and said in a clear voice that carried easily to every corner of the hall, "This house does not function without you. I do not require your services. I am asking you to stay." The room was silent in the way that rooms are only silent when they are full. Lady Dorothea was visible at the drawing-room door. Something moved in her face. A small, precise recognition. The particular expression of a woman who has confidently arranged an outcome and is understanding, for the first time, that the arrangement has come apart. Cecily stood near the fire with the careful composure of a woman absorbing a clear message. She was not cruel in her nature. She had been positioned and had accepted the positioning, and she accepted this development with the same surface grace that had been trained into her, though later, in her carriage, she would allow herself to feel it. Mrs. Prewitt, at the passage door, pressed her closed fist briefly against her mouth. Edie looked at Nicholas. She looked at him for a long moment, with the accumulated weight of 6 years of service, and 3 months of cold in a cottage, and 1 night in a sick room, and all the deniable small evidences of a man whose body had been registering her presence long before his mouth had found words for it. She looked at the portmanteau in his hand, and the steadiness in his face, and the hall full of witnesses who had heard every word. She was not, by nature, a woman who made declarations. She was a woman who acted. The action available to her was small and exact. She held out her hand for the letter. He gave it to her. She walked back to the hall table and set it carefully against the base of the holly arrangement where Thomas would find it in the morning, and then she turned back to face the room. "The serving order requires attention," she said, "to the room in general and to no one in particular. I will manage it." There was a moment, and then the room exhaled, and the conversations resumed. And Nicholas's expression shifted in a way that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it, the nearest he came in public to letting something show. Lady Dorothea moved back into the drawing room. She said nothing. She sat in her chair by the fire and held her fan at precisely the correct height and did not speak for 20 minutes. And when she finally spoke, she addressed the woman beside her about the quality of the current season's wool, and she did not, for the rest of that evening, use the word housekeeper. The Christmas Eve gathering ran its course with the smooth, unremarkable efficiency that Edie had built for it. The food was correct. The fires burned at the right level. The guests departed in good order through the cold, their carriage lanterns moving in a line down the drive, like a slowly dissolving parade. By midnight, the hall was quiet. Nicholas found her in the kitchen passage, checking that the fires were banked for the night. She heard his step and turned, and they stood for a moment in the warm, low light of the passage lantern. He said, formally and quietly, that he had spoken to his solicitor in the matter of a permanent household arrangement, and that if she was willing to remain at Ashbourne Hall in a capacity that would give her both security and authority, he would be glad to discuss the terms. He said this with the measured precision of a man who is saying one thing and meaning something larger, trusting the person he is speaking to hear the larger thing without requiring him to abandon his composure. She said she understood the terms. He said there were also personal considerations he would wish to raise, in due course, if she was not unwilling to hear them. She said she was not unwilling. He nodded, with the gravity of a man who has said more than he intended, and is grateful that it was received carefully. He wished her a good night. He went upstairs. She stood in the passage for a moment, and allowed herself one full breath of something that was not quite happiness, but was the immediate precursor to it. The particular warmth of understanding that the world has shifted in the direction of good, and that it has done so because of the specific actions of a specific person who has seen you clearly. Christmas morning came with snow. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs at 7 o'clock in his dressing gown, with the letter in his hand, and a complexion that was thoroughly recovered, and eyes that were bright with a child's furious alertness. He read out the part about the 7th chapter of the Sailor Book with considerable indignation, because he had, in fact, already found it, and would have liked to be asked rather than told. Edie, at the foot of the stairs with a cup of tea she had just brought up from the kitchen, said that she had suspected as much, but had wanted to be encouraging. Thomas said that was not the same as being accurate. She said it was sometimes more valuable. He considered this and came down the stairs and accepted the cup of tea she offered him, even though it was hers, and stood beside her at the hall window looking at the snow on the park. It was coming steadily, the way December snow comes at Ashbourne, in large, unhurried flakes that settled on the elm branches and the gravel and the stone lip of the fountain, without any fuss. Nicholas came down at 7:30 and found them there. He stopped on the bottom stair and looked at his son standing at the window with the letter in one hand and a borrowed cup of tea in the other, and at the woman beside him, and something in his face that had been held tight for 2 years simply let go. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the expression of a man who recognizes, in a completely ordinary moment, the specific arrangement that constitutes his home. Lady Dorothea came down at 8. She paused at the foot of the stairs and looked at the three of them in the gray winter light, and then she looked at Edie, and something in her face was quieter than it had been. The assurance of a woman who has organized her life around correct order, meeting the evidence that order, in this instance, had reordered itself correctly without her management. She said, to Edie directly and without qualification, that the Garlands were very well done this year. It was not an apology. It was not required to be. It was the precise acknowledgement available to her, and she gave it with the dignity of a woman who had been wrong about something important, and was choosing grace over silence. Edie said she was glad they had turned out well. They left it there, and it was enough. The morning passed in the comfortable disorder of Christmas, which is its own kind of order. Thomas ate breakfast with a thoroughness that made Miss Parton, when she arrived at 9, visibly relieved. The kitchen produced a series of things at appropriate intervals. The snow continued. By early afternoon, the house was warm and quiet in the particular way of a house that has been through something difficult and has come out the other side. A fire burned in the library grate. Thomas had fallen asleep in the window seat, with his sailor book open across his chest, the snow filling the window behind him in slow, white accumulations. Nicholas sat at his desk with the estate correspondence he had been meaning to attend to, and attended to none of it, because Edie was in the chair across from the window seat, reading, and the quality of the room did not permit inattention. He set down his pen. He said her name. Not Miss Hartwell. Her name. And she looked up from her book. He said, with the direct economy of a man who had learned, after some cost, that the right words given plainly were worth more than the eloquent ones withheld. I should like, if you are willing, to ask you something beyond the formal arrangement. She set her book down on the arm of the chair. She said that she was willing. Outside the library window, the snow was coming down over the park of Ashbourne Hall in the steady, unhurried way of snow that intends to stay. The elms were white along their upper branches. The fountain was silent and white. The drive was unmarked, and the lane to the village was 2 miles of unbroken snow, and the cottage at the end of it was empty now, its £40 debt discharged from the estate accounts in November, and the key returned to the solicitor. Thomas slept. The fire burned. She was home. If Edie's story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you. These are the stories worth remembering.